Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL week number 8 overview and analysis video, the final one in the regular season here in the LPL. Very excited to get into it. It's kind of a shortened week, only 8 series, 4 days to go over in terms of games, but still a lot of very interesting outcomes to talk about. It's not exactly like we aren't getting top tier matchups as we head into the final week here, and there are still some things left to play for some of these teams. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. To add on to what is going to be in this video, as per normal, we're going to be going through every single series. If you are new here, what we do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. But on top of that, because it is the end of the regular season, I will also be giving out my personal all-pro picks for the regular season. So first team, second team, and third team. I have not done the second and third team for the other regions, but the LPL has basically played a full schedule so far this year, and so we have a lot more to go off of. And then we will be previewing the play-in, series that end up happening. There are 4 that are going to qualify, the final 4 teams. The first 4 will qualify based on being the top 4 in Group Ascend, but those other 4 will be chosen from those play-in series. We're going to kind of talk about them and my expectations for what's going to happen with them, but that's going to be at the end of the video. Most of today is still going to be spent talking about what happened in week number 8, the games that we got, and where we stand heading into the playoffs. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the content itself, shall we? We start off with a pretty interesting matchup, I would say an important matchup for one of these teams, and it was Weibo Gaming taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and Weibo Gaming is going to pick up the 2-0, and this is a really important 2-0 for them to grab. Obviously, they're the better team here. I think everybody would have expected them to be able to come out and beat FunPlus Phoenix, but this team has been ice cold ever since being white hot for a couple of weeks. It's been very funny to watch the transition with them and Invictus Gaming basically swapping places, where both of those teams had periods where they looked awesome and periods where they looked awful. Unfortunately for Weibo, their bad form is right now. They're coming off of some really bad form at the end of the split, which is never really a great time for that to happen, but this is the time for a get-right series. This is the time to go into a team like FPX, who, again, if you've watched the channel for a little while, you'll know that obviously my opinion on FPX is that they really struggle at beating teams that actually show up on the day. They're good at a lot of things. They're not really great at anything, which means that if these upper-tier teams actually play up to their own standards, FPX don't really have a shot. A lot of their wins have just been in situations where the team that they're going into underperforms or makes some sort of gigantic mistake. That is their best trait, as a team is capitalizing on the mistakes that the other team makes, but they don't really generate a ton of pressure on their own unless Joy gets mega strong, unless he's able to move around the map and create everything for the team. But Weibo actually did step in and really, stepped up here today to be able to create a lot for themselves, and mostly it was through the middle of the map, which I think is a good sign. Xiaohu is going to get my player of the series here. I have a very interesting take on Xiaohu that I just don't think people are going to be particularly happy about. Not that I've shied away from those this year. I'm still getting comments on my LTA video about how absurd it is that I said Umti was pretty good in the spring split, the best jungler in my opinion in terms of production in the spring split, so I'm certainly no stranger to unpopular opinions, but Xiaohu's been really good in 2025. I get it. If you look at the numbers and if you watch his games during the losing streak, you probably don't have it click in your head like, oh, this guy's been, a top 3, top 4 mid laner in the LPL. But what Xiaohu does right now is what he has always done in his prime, and this is the kind of player I've always talked about him as. He's not a good laner. He's really not that dominant of a 1v1 player. He never was, even at his absolute best. When he was, winning MSI and, doing all those things on RNG, he was never a great laner. He was never somebody who generated a ton of leads early, and so when you look at his GD at 15 or his XP D at 15, you don't really see a ton of, gigantic, earth-shattering numbers, but he is so clean and consistent when you get into the later stages of the game in terms of how he executes from playing from neutral that it ends up not really mattering. And I think once again, we kind of got an inclination of that in this series. The Ryze and the Orianna both were excellent, and he was no doubt the player of the series. And honestly, he's gotten a ton of these over the course of this split, way more than almost any other LPL mid laner. It's him and Knight that clear everybody else in terms of the player of the series that I've given out. And that kind of reflects itself in the player of the game standings that the LPL actively has. And so I do want to give him a lot of credit. I think he's being undervalued because people look at the bad games and look at what happens when his entire team loses tempo and sees a player that really struggles to be able to carry or lift a team above what they are. And I think that is true. That's just kind of the player that he is because he isn't very lane dominant. But when things go right for him, when he's in a comfortable spot, he is one of the best team fighters in the world. And that's why when this team is winning, oftentimes he is the one who looks the best and is the one that is performing the best on that team. So I still like Xiaohu. I think he's playing way better than he did last year. And I honestly don't think he's getting the credit he deserves, even if there are some mechanical, things you can nitpick when it comes to his game. But the rest of the team was also solid. One thing I haven't talked about yet, Hong is back in the lineup here for Weibo Gaming. He will be for the rest of the week. I'm, again, really against the grain. I'm really against popular opinion here. This is a no-brainer decision for me. Hong's upside is significantly higher than Erha's is as a player, just in terms of what we have seen in the past. We have to remember, we can't get revisionist history by what Hong has been at the beginning of this year. Going into 2025, Hong was known as the support in the LPL that was the most consistent. That was his thing. That was the thing that he was before joining Weibo Gaming, who, I should remind you, has had supports be super inconsistent for as long as they've existed as an organization, whether it's been On, whether it's been Crisp, it doesn't really matter. Whoever's in that position has not been able to hang on to any sort of consistency, and I think a lot of that has to do with some of the players around here, most notably Xiaohu in the mid lane, who asks a lot more of his support to be able to step up, but Hong as a player is just better than Erha, in my opinion, and I think he's going to get the chance to express that. He was really good in this series, going up against Jue, who is one of the most productive supports in the entire league, certainly for a team that's near the middle of the standings, and Hong was just better than him. So credit to him there. Light, I think, looked a lot more comfortable with Hong in than he ever did with Erha. There are times where Light can step up and be a team fight threat, but I think it's nice to have somebody who can create down in the bot lane as well. Tien and Breathe were also nice. They were fine. Shadow actually had a pretty decent series in terms of his aggressiveness, but Weibo really ran through the middle of the map, and I think that was Xiaohu's credit, and I think we should give him a lot of praise for that. And then for FunPlus on the other side, they are who we thought they were. Like, there is no mistaking who FPX is. I don't think this team has a bevy of talent. I don't think they're particularly mechanically skillful. I think they have a couple of players who can express themselves in that regard. Jue obviously comes to mind as a playmaker for this team. He even got the Nico that's been basically permabanned against FPX throughout this year. I think Sheer can be a player that, could really look great in certain matchups. It's just hard to do that as Sion in Game 2, and even on the Aurora in Game 1, you're playing into Gwen, and you're playing into Breathe, and it's not necessarily always going to go your way, but the rest of this team is more so just good, maybe not great. Shadow has great games and also horrible games. He was not the problem in this series. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Care in the mid lane, who I've just continued to be like, all right, like, I think I would be more excited about Care, and I'd be more optimistic about what he was as a player if he was in Group Nirvana, ironically enough, because I think what being in Group Ascend has just shown us about Care is that he is, like, the definition of, like, the 10th best mid laner in the LPL. He's not good enough to go up against a lot of the mid laners here in Group Ascend. If he were in Group Nirvana, I imagine he would be performing rather well. Think of someone like Angel right now on Edward Gaming, who's actually looking pretty solid going up against these lower tier teams. I think Care would be in a similar position. I think they're similar players, but because he has so much more of a responsibility going up against some of the best mid laners in the world over and over again in Group Ascend, it just becomes very difficult for him to actually look average, and I think we're seeing that. I'm still not a fan of Assume as a player. I think he's overhyped, but FPX is what they are. No surprises here to see them drop. I honestly don't think they're a particularly good team, but one that could sneak their way into the playoffs, just based off the fact that if the other team doesn't show up, they're good enough to capitalize on those mistakes. But for Weibo, hopefully this means they're getting into form. I like the reintegration of Hong into the lineup. I think it will make them better, and generally, if Xiaohu specifically or Breathe can really step up and be a primary carry option, this team can definitely still be closer to top 4 like they were just a couple of months ago. But then moving on now to our second series of day number 1, and it was a pretty predictable outcome. Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on JD Gaming, and JDG picking up the 2-0 victory. JDG obviously came off of a week number 7 where they looked, up and down. They had their loss to Invictus that I think scared a lot of people, but a big win over Bilibili Gaming that really cemented them as one of the better teams in the league, with BLG basically being unstoppable up until that point. That was their first series loss with Beishuan in the starting lineup, so a really nice week, all things considered, even with that loss to Invictus for JDG, but once again, they needed to follow that up by being consistent in some way, shape, or form, because their problem has not necessarily been their good games, it's been their bad games that have really concerned me, and JDG really showed up here today. They were the better team by a pretty considerable margin. 2 lanes ended up super gapping their opponents on the other side, which I'm excited to talk about, and then generally, a couple of players also stepping up. For Ninjas in Pyjamas, this team is just deeply flawed at multiple levels. People are going to look at 1 or 2 of these players and kind of talk about how they're the problem, or, if you got rid of these players, everything would be fixed. I just don't think it's quite that simple for Ninjas in Pyjamas. I think that there is just a real issue in terms of how this team plays the map, and they're not a particularly consistent team in that regard, but we'll go ahead and talk about that, starting with JDG. Player of the series for me is going to go to Pyjamas in the bot lane. This guy's been unreal throughout all of this year so far. Him and Shun have been an unbelievably good duo in 2025. It's been actually really fun to watch, and, you know, I've kind of gone to bat. I've said Pyjamas is the best AD carry in the LPL for all of this year. I mean, go back to my takes in winter. That's exactly what I was saying. It's funny because Lee was actually the player who got All-Pro over Pyjamas. I thought that that was ridiculous at the time, and I called it out, and, you know, it's kind of aged incredibly well for me, but Pyjamas has just been awesome. He's been everything this team could have asked for, and then some. I'm not sitting here saying he's better than Ruler, but, you know, this is more than what Ruler gave JDG last year. That's certainly all I'm going to say. Pyjamas has been the #1 option for this team, and specifically on that Kai'Sa in game number 2, he really embodied the LPL spirit by completely taking over the game on one of the LPL's most famous picks. So credit to him. He's been awesome throughout this year so far. You also got to give a lot of credit to Shun. Somehow, some way, we continue to fall into this universe and into this trap where the better jungler in every series gets Neferi, and I just don't really understand how this keeps happening. I bring this up all the time in the LPL, and it's just like, why are we giving players like Shun Neferi? Why don't we give Aki Neferi? I get that obviously you don't want to do that if you're JDG, and maybe that is what separates the good teams from the bad teams, but why do the good junglers keep getting the good champions over and over again? He ends up dominating on that champion. I think it's double-digit kills in that game #1 on the dog, and obviously looks fantastic. That's just generally what happens for teams that have good junglers that get Neferi, but Pyjamas and Shun have been dynamite so far in 2025. They've been some of the best players, if not the best players in their roles in the LPL, certainly in contention for first team All-Pro, both of them, but it wasn't just them this series. I thought Missing played phenomenal in game #2 on the Rakan. Really great game for him to constantly be putting pressure onto the backline of Ninjas in Pyjamas, specifically onto the Tristana, which we will definitely talk about as we continue to move forward. Missing has been super bad, I would say, throughout most of this year, so to see him step up and even be average for this team in this series is big, and if he's going to be a positive, that completely changes the outlook of what they can be. That probably makes them a top 2 team by themselves. Like, Missing is the piece that's holding them back the most, in my opinion. Ala has also been much better over the past week and a half. He started off this year absolutely miserably, looked like one of the weakest top laners in Group Ascend, but he has started to figure things out, and again, over the last week and a half, he's been pretty good. Like, overall, just like actually productive, a very Ala-esque type of performance here this series, where he doesn't need a ton of resources in order to be useful, and he can get himself involved in a lot of plays, either with the Equalizer in game 1 or with the Shen ultimate in game #2. Scout's been fine. Really haven't talked about him all that much. He's not really losing. He's doing fine in terms of the statistics. He's just not been a main character on this team, which is ironic because Scout has always been criticized for needing too many resources in order to be useful. So credit to JDG. I think they finally started to find their pattern that works for them, and they found a way to get all 5 members involved, which is something they haven't been able to do a lot of this year. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, it's just very clear that this team has no structure, like that there's no consistency in terms of either the shot calling or the decision making throughout a lot of these games, because it varies from second to second what each play is looking like. You can kind of point out that Doinby was trying to 1v9 this series. I think that's kind of fair. He also didn't need to try and do that on Akali and on Galio, where he was way too far forward in a lot of instances and playing without the rest of his team. That being said, the rest of his team was kind of garbage. Aki got completely out-jungled, gigantic jungle canyon in favor of Shun in this series. Not that that should be surprising to anybody, but again, I'll go back to what I said last week, which is that Aki probably gets a bit more criticism than he, necessarily deserves right now. He's a player that's kind of similar to what I just talked about with Care. He'd probably look really great in Group Nirvana because he's probably way better than all of the Group Nirvana junglers. The problem is that he's not in Group Nirvana. He has to play the great junglers over and over again, and he can't really survive on that front. But to me, Leave was the obvious choice for Dead of the series here. What is he doing in game #2 on the Tristana? This guy just has complete lapses in judgment. Almost every single game, it was something that we thought he was working out of his system playing with PP God and Doinby. That has not been the case at all. He continues to just make gigantic mistakes in the back half of these games, even when he's in an okay position. And you know what? He was the reason that Ninjas in Pyjamas ended up losing this series. So, I'm very out on Leave. I just don't ever believe he's going to be consistent enough to be a top tier player. People say that he plays like Jackie Love. I completely disagree. Jackie Love never had these kinds of problems. Like, would he step up too far forward sometimes? Yeah, but he would trade 2 for 1. Leave just dies randomly consistently every game for no reason. There is no explanation. It's just him not thinking. There's nothing else to say. It's frustrating for Leave. PP God's been very bad in the support position, very quietly one of the worst supports in Group Ascend. I think Solo Kill has kind of come back down to earth, even if I do think he's still a good player. And Doinby is just so flippy himself because of the way he wants to play the game. There's no consistency with Ninjas and Pyjamas, and I would be shocked if that ever grew. And then for JD Gaming, like we said, like the problem for this team and what they have been so far this year has been a two-headed monster of Pays and Shun, and even at times Scout looking okay. If Ala and Missing are finally going to step up and be actively positive pieces for this team, who's to keep them out of top 2 and who's to keep them out of an international tournament? But then moving on now to day number 2, and we kick day 2 off with the matchup between FunPlus Phoenix and Invictus Gaming, and this time it's IG who gets the chance to beat up on FPX, who just have absolutely no macro to speak of. This team just has no way to play the back end of this. They have an Akali who gets pretty fed at the start of the game that ends up completely running it down by the end of the game, and then obviously no way to play late game team fights. And luckily for Invictus, they had enough good things going for them that they were able to overcome some of their own ineptitude that they ended up playing through in game number 2. So I'm excited to go over it. There are a couple of players that I think are worth talking about, a couple of performances that I think definitely stood out to me, but once again, I have to give player of the series to Jeje in the jungle. I've given him so many of these across this year. I believe he's tied for second in terms of how many player of the series he's gotten on this channel, only behind Kanavi. In terms of like leading the entirety of the LPL, it's actually absurd how consistent I think he's been. And it's all within the framework of these horrible setups. I think that's what makes it even more impressive to me, is he gets himself into these really bad positions in terms of these games. His smites have been very questionable throughout 2025 so far, and you know, he's really good at letting other teams back into the game, but he's always the one to close the door on a lot of these games, even if he is the reason why the door is open in the first place. It's a pretty funny way to end up playing the game at a high level, but I think he has been super valuable and super important to the team, and I think he once again was that here. The Skarner was what won them the series in game number 2. I think without Jeje playing the way that he did in some of those final fights, they probably don't end up winning, so big credit to him. Again, Shadow was fine on the other side, ended up having a bajillion stacks on Sejuani by the end of the game, but the Skarner was just a little bit more relevant in terms of the CC he was able to dole out, and in terms of what he was able to create in terms of being the aggressor in some of those fights, and that's really what tipped Invictus Gaming over the edge. So credit to them, you know, credit to Jeje. I think he's like a very sneaky choice for All-Pro. People are not putting him into that conversation. I promise you, I will be putting him into that conversation, which might not be the most popular opinion in the world, but also worth pointing out, the Shy actually had a good series here. I have been seeing some things. I'm certainly not going to, you know, talk about every single All-Pro ballot that I've seen from every Twitter user online or whatever for the LPL, but I've seen people putting the Shy in like the top 3 top laners. You've got to be on crack. Like, if you're doing that, I truly believe it. Like, there's no way that you watch this guy play for a majority of the year and you went, he was more consistent and more helpful to his team than, you know, 3 other top laners in the league. It's just absurd. Like, you know what I mean? Respect to him, but the Rumble game, at the very least in game number 1, was good. There were definitely moments of game 2 on the Jax that I think were really positive, and he was the other player that I think really was, you know, an up arrow for Invictus in this series, which they don't always have out of the top side of the map. Ironically enough, after game number 1 in particular, it was really the bot lane that ended up being a little bit, you know, up and down for me. Mako, that's not particularly surprising, but I've been super high on what Gala has been for this team the past couple of weeks, and obviously, I think that he's mattered a ton in their wins, but that Xayah game was not consistent. The Rakan game was certainly not consistent for Mako, who has had a really rough split, all things considered. And also, I don't think Rookie was, like, phenomenal. I think he was solid. He was standard. He was normal in this series, but he certainly wasn't somebody that I think came out and dominated in the way that maybe you would want. It really was Jeje setting things up on the Skarner and then the Shy on the Rumble in game number 1 that really pushed everything over the top. So at least Invictus had their, you know, the most important players step up, or the players they needed to step up. But at the end of the day, you really want to see this team start to get it together like around the horn, and it really does feel a bit more, I guess, limited in terms of how they can win games. That being said, it seems to go on a week-to-week basis which version of this team you're gonna get. If this is the bad version, maybe the good version shows up for play-ins. And then for FPX on the other side, like, this team is who we thought they were. The unfortunate part for them is they kind of had game number 2 in the palm of their hand. They had a super fed Akali and a ton of awesome setup for him, with Shadow on the Sejuani being in a pretty decent position, and even Jway on the Alistair, you know, looking to be pretty important in the back half of this game, and it just did not end up coming to fruition. Care misplays the hell out of the back half of this game. There's nothing else really to say, so much so that I'm actually giving him dud of the series, even though he was the Fed member in game number 2. I try to stay away from this because oftentimes if you're the reason that a team is in the game in the first place, it's hard for you to be the problem, even if you're the reason they lose by misplaying in the back half, because they wouldn't have been there in the first place if it weren't for you. But Care was a special exception in this one because he was funneled in the early game. They gave this Akali absolutely everything that they could give him, and he still messed it up in the back half of the game, and that's where I think the difference lies. He didn't generate the lead on his own. He didn't play awesome in the first half of the game. He just played fine in the first half of the game, did a good job of being able to capitalize on the things set up for him, and then screwed the pooch in the late game, which I think is even worse. So Care is dead of the series for the second time here in week number 8. That being said, Care stepped up a ton in the playoffs last year. After he had a really bad summer split, he actually was really big in their one playoff win in 2024, so who knows, maybe it happens again, but the rest of this team was generally fine. Sheer was definitely not as good as the Shy on the top side, not that that should be surprising, although it is kind of a little surprising, I will say that. Like, Sheer maybe has been better this year than the Shy has, but overall, you know, the Shy should be better, so I think it's not shocking there. Shadow, Assume, Jway, they were all fine. They generally did their jobs and set things up, but FPX don't have the skill set to be as good as Invictus if you're not going to have the player you gave all the resources stepping up and carrying games. So Care letting them down was a pretty big deal. And then for Invictus, I just want to see them be consistent in some semblance. Like, even in this game that they ended up winning, Jeje was a reason they were in the hole before they dug themselves out of it, before Jeje in particular dug himself out of it. And so you just would love to see like a really dominant performance akin to what they showed against JD Gaming last week, but I guess we have to save those for the top teams, don't we? But then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and this was the big one for me. I think you could make an argument these are the two best teams in the LPL going head-to-head. It was Top Esports taking on Bilibili Gaming, and BLG pull off the upset. They pick up the 2-0 win. They do so in pretty dominant fashion, and this really makes the top of the LPL interesting. We already knew that it was going to be a big cluster between the top 5 teams. In fact, I've been saying it more so than almost any other analyst over the past couple of weeks. Again, I don't mean to take a lot of credit for this, but you know, not a lot of people were saying that the difference between number 2 and number 5 last week was, you know, very small, but I absolutely think that that is the case, and I think this goes to show just how small that gap is, and even I was undervaluing and underestimating just where it was, because BLG being able to pull off this win while they, you know, just got blasted by JD Gaming in their previous series shows that there really is not a gigantic difference between the top 5 teams who are very clear right now, and that makes the league fun. One thing that I do want to hit home on when it comes to this segment that I think, you know, I don't try to get irritated by the community too much. I know I fail at that, and these videos are kind of proof of that because I go on rants all the freaking time in these videos. I talk about Reddit and whatever all the time in terms of the things that frustrate me when it comes to them, but I do want to say, like, the thing that really does get under my skin the most is when in times like last year, where you have a team like BLG and they're dominating the league and it's clear that they're head and shoulders above everybody else, or 2023 when it was JD Gaming, people are like, oh, the league is so boring, the winner's already determined, it's, you know, the same team dominating over and over again. And then you have a year like this where 5 teams could conceivably be the number 1 team in the power rankings in terms of consistency at the current moment, and all you hear, the only narrative is, oh, the LPL's so bad, none of these teams are good, there's actually no competition, they're gonna get blasted by Europe and North America and, you know, whatever, right? Like, can fans ever be happy about anything? Like, is it possible for LPL fans to enjoy the game in any capacity? Like, why do you even watch? What's even the point, man? Like, it does get me a little bit frustrated, and I'm sorry to go on that tangent right at the beginning of a segment where I'm going to be talking about how fun and creative the league is, but it really does grind my gears, and it gets under my skin of just, like, what are we trying to do? What are we trying to make clear as fans? The league is boring when there's a 1 or 2 teams dominating at the top, and the league is boring when there's a ton of parity. Why are you watching? Why? You clearly don't enjoy the product, but that's neither here nor there. We'll talk about that a bit later. Let's actually go into the game itself because there is a lot to talk about here. BLG just kind of won everywhere. I think you can give credit to every single player on this team for being super valuable and better than their opposition in this series. Player of the series for me, though, might come a bit out of left field. It's going to go to On in the support position. I thought he was the most relevant player on the Rift in terms of what he was creating. He mega destroyed Top Esports in Game 2 on that rel. There was no play that they could actively make after or around like 15 minutes into the game. By that point, the game was entirely over. There was nothing else for Top Esports to be able to do. On completely stifled all of their game plans, and it was honestly super impressive to see. I think he's been awesome across this split. You could make an argument he's been the best support in the LPL. I think that there is a strong argument in that case. It's him or Kale in terms of just how things have gone so far in 2025, but On is very much in the conversation, and this only strengthens that argument for me. I really do think he's been that good for BLG, and he really showed up here today. But again, this was a team effort. This wasn't one player kind of taking over and destroying. Bin and Knight definitely deserve their flowers in each of their individual games for being primary, creators in terms of how things ended up playing out. Knight in game number 1 on the Annie and Bin in game 2 on the Ornn. Both of them have been exceptionally good ever since Beishwan came back into the lineup. Bin had that one series last week against JDG where he ended up really underperforming, but other than that, he's been spectacular with Beishwan in the lineup, specifically on these like side laners, which I think is really important because that's what he was bad at the beginning of the split. And Knight has just been an MVP caliber player the entire split. Even when things were going wrong for BLG, he was good, but when Beishwan came in, he got re-unlocked. He became the best player in the LPL again. Beishwan was obviously good himself, like on the Pantheon, on the Lilia. He did a great job of enabling his lanes and setting himself up for a lot of damage success. And Elk went 21 and 18 in terms of how things went. I'm a lot lower on what Elk has been so far this year. Again, another thing, I hear people kind of putting Elk in all-pro conversations. To me, that's recency bias. Like, if you would have asked me in the first half of the split, he would not have even been top 5 in terms of the 80 carries. And I get that, it's a full split award and things like that, but Elk's nowhere close to being an all-pro, in my opinion. That being said, he definitely is getting into form as of right now, and On's still doing a lot of heavy lifting, which I think is really good for BLG. This was just a very complete win over the best team in the LPL. This shows me that BLG can win the entire league. I think that's a fair thing to expect from this team. And then for Top Esports on the other side, this is a bit of a disappointing outcome because really you wanted to go into playoffs with as much momentum as possible. Ironically enough, I think that there are some things out there that make me encouraged in this loss, most notably this weird like hex that's been on the LPL where it's like top teams that are really hot and have no problems going into playoffs oftentimes underperform. A team that has major question marks ends up stepping up and being the team that actually makes it work. And so maybe that's going to be the case for Top Esports. But, superstition aside, there are real issues in how they played out this map. Kanavi is going to get dud of the series. I think he was the one who was picked on the most, even if he wasn't the one who was causing the most amount of problems in this series, in my opinion. I think he was the one who definitely kind of suffered the most at the hands of BLG. Beishwan did a great job of taking him out of the series, and like I already stated, On made his life a living hell towards the back half of game number 2. Very difficult to play that out, and these aggressive picks aren't going to work out if you're going to be playing in that regard. I think it's also worth pointing out that Cream has been quite bad as of late. Not really a lot of positive things to talk about in that regard for him. Again, another player that I just do not get the all-pro hype for. I really don't think he's even been close to that kind of form. I think Top Esports has went through many different avenues, and Cream has not been any of them, in my opinion. And I'm the Cream defender. He was one of my first channel darlings, and I'm somebody who has hyped him up and talked about him as one of the better mids in the world for a long time. I just don't think this was the split to kind of showcase that, and I think he got mega outplayed by Knight and even by Beishwan in terms of how things went here. Crisp was super gapped by On the other side. Jackie Love couldn't really do anything here. 369, who's been the best top laner in the league, never really had any pressure or priority here. Top Esports just kind of felt outclassed, and to me, this is fun and this is interesting. I know some people are going to get frustrated with Top Esports for doing this, but this shows how open-ended the top of the LPL standings are. If Top Esports is going to be considered the favorite because they're the #1 seed heading into the playoffs, well, here you go. Bilibili very much could take it all. There was a reason I moved them all the way up to my top 2 before moving them back down to number 4 with their loss to JDG last week, and it's because I think the high-end upside of this team is the best team in the LPL, and there really is a strong chance that I'm going to be picking them as the team I expect to win the LPL going into playoffs. But then moving on now to day number 3, and the banger games do not stop rolling in as we get yet another top-of-the-table clash, this time between JD Gaming and Anyone's Legend, where JD Gaming are going to pick up a massive 2-0 victory. So in back-to-back series, we have BLG toppling Top Esports, a team that has barely been beaten at all across this year, and JD Gaming really cementing themselves at the top of the standings, taking down Anyone's Legend. Truly, anybody can win the LPL right now. You have to remember last week Invictus very clearly was better than JD Gaming, and so there are a lot of things to kind of discuss right now when it comes to what the top of the standings in the LPL looks like, and I don't think I've been more excited for an LPL playoff run than I am right now, just in terms of the amount of parity there is and just the amount of things that could realistically happen for these teams. Like, there have been upsets in the past, but for the most part we kind of knew who the favorites were going in to a lot of the playoff runs, even if a team like Weibo made a random finals run last year, OMG, randomly making top 4 a couple of years ago, There are like a couple of outliers that you can point to as like, ooh, big upset here or big upset there. But at the end of the day, like there's not going to be any upsets here because everybody is predicted to be a team that could theoretically lose. And that makes it so interesting. But when you get into a series like this, you have to give JDG a lot of credit. And this really reinforces everything that I've been saying about this team all year. As long as they don't have players like Ala and Missing being as bad as they have been for a majority of this split, this team is one of the best in the entire league, if not the best in the entire league, because the core of this team has already been so good for them. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Speaking of Ala, he is going to get player of the series for me on the top side here when it comes to JD Gaming. He did a great job on both the Rumble and the Yorick in order to be able to generate his own leads, but it's really that Yorick game in game 2 that he took over. We're going to talk about it, but you can't pick Nasus in the LPL right now. I get that Flandra and, a couple of other players have tried to make this thing work, but it's just too greedy. It's really difficult to get away with it, and if you're not able to get any sort of resources in the early game, or if you're targeted a lot in the early game, it becomes pretty difficult to stay alive, and Ala took advantage of that there on the Yorick. He did a great job in terms of just how he played out the laning phase, and I thought he really, stepped up and generated his own resources, and that's, again, something that's kind of been more of the case the past couple of weeks. He's been in pretty good form over the last 2.5 or so weeks. I do want to, remind people, I know people are kind of high on how he's played so far as of late. This guy might have been the single worst top laner in Group Ascend through the first 6 weeks. Like, he was unplayable, and he was the only reason that JDG was losing games for a small section of time. Missing obviously was a part of that as well, but he was not particularly good for most of this split, and so him stepping up and JDG starting to get a bit more consistent in terms of how they're winning games, those two things are absolutely correlated in terms of the results. Like, him not being a nuisance on the top side for his own team and actively being a positive, and JDG, having success, that's definitely going to be something that I'm watching throughout the rest of the playoffs. And the reason this is so important, because remember winners finals from the winter split. I know that feels like a forever ago, a long time ago in terms of how things have gone, but Flandra mega gapped Ala in that series in terms of how things ended up going. And so to see the tables kind of turned in this one, that was probably the reason things ended up shifting. But you still got to give a lot of credit elsewhere. Pays continues to be an absolute menace for this team. I mean, he's been the best AD carry in the LPL. I don't even really think it's all that debatable. I love how Jackie Love has played. I think players like Hope and Gala have been really great as well in the LPL, but Pays has been far and away, in my opinion, the best AD carry in terms of production. I think he's so important to what JDG do, and even when this team was struggling, he was still performing well. This guy's just awesome. Shun's been pretty solid. I think Tarzan was honestly fine in this series. He was probably the best player on AL in terms of the consistent pieces that they had, but Shun was still good enough to be able to go up against him and perform well, which is nice. Scout has been pretty stable in the mid lane, has not needed to get a lot of resources, which again is kind of against the reputation that Scout has generated for himself. And then even Missing had a really good series here going into Kale, so it's just all good. It's all coming up, green for JDG right now. I guess it's all coming up dark maroon, whatever color you want to describe JDG's as. Everything is coming up great right now for them. It's all really working out, and I'm excited for them. And then for AL on the other side, this loss is a bit concerning because, again, it kind of reiterates that the top of the standings is not locked in by any means, but we're not going to pretend like AL is some unbeatable team. They play great as a unit, but they are also a bunch of players that are not necessarily considered to be top 1 or top 2 in their role in the league. Tarzan really the only one, and, Kale in the support position. I think they're the only two that are really in that conversation. Maybe Flandra on the top side, but he picked Galio and Nasus in this series and ended up being super useless, and so it did not end up working out. But if there is a player to kind of praise for this performance, it's Tarzan. I think he actually played pretty well here, and obviously you don't need me to glaze Tarzan. I've done that throughout this entire channel's history. I've continuously called him my favorite player in the world, but I think there were other performances. I don't think Hope was all that bad here. I think you can point out some mistakes that Shanks or KL made in terms of just how things went down, but Flandra is the obvious choice for dead of the series because of that Nasus game in game 2 where he was entirely useless. The dog got shut down. It did not work out, and like we talked about, I think a big turning point for why this series went the way that it did in comparison to how it's gone in the past is this top lane matchup. If Flandra is able to take advantage of the fact that he has been way better than Ala across this year, then yeah, AL are probably going to be able to dominate this series. If he's not able to do that, they might not be able to win a lot of playoff series. So it definitely becomes a lot more interesting, and there's just a lot to talk about at the top of the standings. So we will see how things break down, but with AL dropping a series here, JD Gaming picking up a series here, guaranteeing themselves top 4, even if I think BLG technically did that for them in the previous series, it's all just really, really great for JD Gaming. And once again, very similar to what I said about Bilibili, if they walk out of the playoffs not only going to an international tournament, but being the champions from the LPL, I'm not even really going to be all that surprised with how open it is. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it's another big one. It's back-to-back-to-back banger series between top 5 teams, this time Invictus Gaming taking on Bilibili Gaming. And BLG picks up yet another phenomenal victory for themselves by picking up the first 2-1 of the week. Every single series up until this point has been a 2-0 sweep. We finally got a 3-game set, and it did come from a pair of teams that I was really interested to see how they would interact. Of course, this now makes the circle of suck basically complete here in the LPL, at least for the teams that are kind of outside the upper echelon. You've got, the BLG, JDG, Invictus Gaming triangle that's now been completed with IG beating JDG, JDG beating BLG, and BLG beating IG. I don't know why I struggled with that. I knew exactly where I was going with it, but of course, BLG picking up a big win to kind of cement themselves as having one of the best final weeks of any team in the league. Them and JD Gaming both kind of vying for that regard, but for Invictus on the other side, I think that there are still some positives to take away from this. The two players that I've been praising for a majority of this split, I think still played really well in this series. Jeje in particular, I think was a lot better than maybe his scoreline would indicate. The problem for Invictus is the same problem that they've had for a lot of this year, which is just that their inconsistencies really kind of bleed through against the top tier teams. And sometimes you can just get these moments where it feels like a couple of these players are a bit overmatched. But we'll go ahead and get into that. For Bilibili, player of the series for me is going to go to Knight in the mid lane. This guy's been on an unreal run of form over the past couple of weeks. I think that's the fairest way I can possibly put it. He has been absolutely unreal for Bilibili Gaming. Again, you're looking at a player that if he had done this from week number 1, he would easily win MVP. It wouldn't even really be in a conversation. Unfortunately, he wasn't quite playing at this level at the start of the split, which means he's probably just outside of that conversation. At least for me, he's very, very close, but he has been exceptionally good over the past couple of weeks, and I think he is, if he's going to get into form, like if he's going to start being Knight, if he's going to be the MVP front runner, best player in the LPL, which he is playing like right now, this team's gonna win the LPL. Like, that's genuinely the kind of effect he can have on the game, and we're seeing it on multiple different types of champions. Yes, in this series, it's the Ahri, it's the Akali, it's more versatile playmaking type of assassins coming out of the mid lane, but it's not like he can't do this on things like Victor as well. We've seen him be able to take over games in a more consistent, like a Azir type of way if he needs to do that. It's whatever works best for the team, and I think that's what the scariest thing is for teams that have to go into BLG, is that Knight is in form and he's doing everything at a super high level, and especially if you're going to be able to give him assassins, which, by the way, there are just too many in the current meta to be able to ban out all of them. If you're going to be able to give him these priority picks that can start to take over, it's just very difficult for him to be shut off in a lot of these instances. So credit to Knight, he's in incredible form and he played awesome here. I also want to give a big shout out to Bin in the top lane. Bin, once again, having a really good series, being way better than the Shy in terms of how he played out this one. I think his second half of the split has been a bit underrated. Like, again, I know people are pretty out on Bin, but like, I don't want to, harp on the point, but I think his split, all things considered, has been way better than someone like Allah's for JD Gaming, and I don't think he necessarily is kind of getting that reputation. He was really bad at the beginning of the split, so were a lot of top laners, and just like a lot of the other ones, he's turned his split around going into the second half, but I think that the first half wasn't quite as bad as maybe he gets credit for, and I think specifically because he's been so good on things like Yorick in the back half of this split, it's really noticeable just how much he's been able to upgrade his game plan, because that was the kind of stuff he was struggling at the beginning of the split, was playing side lanes and being able to survive without a ton of resources thrown his way. I think he just feels a lot more comfortable with the way that the team is structured now, with Beishuan in instead of Wei. I know that seems like a bit of an ambiguous way to describe it, but that's honestly just kind of how I feel when it comes to Bin. Beishuan has been awesome. Elk and On, I thought, played really well here. Elk had a solid series, I would say. On had a couple of moments where it was like, okay, buddy, let's rein in the Alistair in game number 2. And I'm also not a big fan of Elise support, as anybody who watches the channel knows, and especially the quirky Elise bot lane. It's not something that I really would have expected them to win a do or die game number 3 on, but it did work out for them, and you give them credit for it. But really, this was a series where you can highlight the solo laners, and I think that that is one of the most encouraging things for me. And then for Invictus on the other side, their problems are the exact opposite of the strengths of BLG. It's the solo laners that really let them down in this series. Jeje actually played really well. I honestly don't even think the KDA really indicates how active he was on the map in these games. And once again, I think Jeje is continuously undervalued as a player at this level. But Gala and Mako were also not the issue. Mako was actually super consistent as an engaged threat throughout the back half of the series, was decent on the Nami in game number 1. I still think Gala is one of the most underrated players in the LPL in terms of the production he's had. Very similar to how I talked about Light for many years. I think Gala is like unironically falling into that role now, where it's just like, hey, this guy never has like horrible games. Can we start talking about that? But that cannot be The same cannot be said, I'll just say, for the solo laners. I think that's the fairest way to say it. The Shy, definitely not as good as Bin on the other side of this, trying to match Yorick with Jax, split pusher for split pusher, and generate pressure early. It did not work, and outside of the Nidalee game, things just didn't really look all that good for the Shy, and that's been kind of regular throughout this split. Rookie in the mid lane, I think people are starting to warm up to him and how he's been playing because he's started to be a lot more consistent, but honestly, the player I would compare Rookie's performances to is someone like Scout on JD Gaming, where he's not really been the one that's pushing Invictus forward. He's more so just been stable enough to allow players like Jejet and Gala to be able to take over a lot of these games, and so when he does end up faltering, that can be a bit of a problem for a team like Invictus, and he's actually going to get my dud of the series here. I know some people might be surprised by this outcome, but man, all I saw mid lane was him losing tempo and losing pressure for his team and not really allowing his fed jungler to actually participate in the game at all, and that's really tough. When Knight is just completely gapping Rookie, it takes Invictus out of being competitive in these games, and that's kind of a necessity in order for Invictus to stay alive in the upper echelon when they're trying to fight to get to MSI, when they're trying to fight to be an upper tier team and to make finals. You know, if Rookie's going to play like this is not a finals caliber mid laner. So some things I think Invictus need to fix, but again, they can turn this on at any given moment, and especially if Jejet and Gala are able to take over games because they are the two most consistent players on this team, ironically enough. You know, I think that's going to be massive for Invictus, and I still think they can be a threat near the top of the standings, but BLG are just on fire right now. I'm not entirely throwing out that loss to JDG from last week, but I don't want to get down on this team. We've seen how good JDG is, and BLG I think is right up there in terms of what their expectations can be. Again, if this team ends up winning the LPL, is anybody really going to be all that surprised? But that's going to bring us to our fourth and final day of action here in my LPL week number 8 video. Again, a shorter week than normal, luckily, here in the LPL with how much content we've been pumping out. But the final week kicks off with a matchup between Team WE and Weibo Gaming, mostly to determine some seeding. And WE pick up a 2-0 series win. Weibo with yet another very quite frankly, embarrassing. I think that's really the only word I can use to kind of describe how bad this loss is. I know this team has been a bit ice cold as of late. We talked about that at the beginning of the week, but they picked up a victory against FPX when they really needed to get themselves back on track, and it felt like things were getting a little bit better, and I've always expected things to turn around for Weibo Gaming because they're just not the kind of team that I expect to stay in a rut for as long as they've stayed in it, but maybe this team is just bad. Like, maybe that's just the reality of where they're at right now, and this loss is actually decently consequential because this could put them down into the number 7 spot instead of the number 6 spot, which means they have to play a Group Ascend team rather than a Group Nirvana team. Now, we'll talk about why that might not be the worst thing in the world for them as we continue to move along, but it's certainly something to keep in mind, and WE with this win might have gotten themselves into top 6 in terms of how things go in the regular season. How is that even possible for a team of this caliber, for where they've been at as of late? It's genuinely absurd, but leave it to the ninjas to pull it out here in game number 2. Not the ones that are wearing pajamas, but rather the Shen, Zed, Akali trio topside coming in from WE in game 2. Really, this is one of the most fun drafts that we've had in the LPL all year long, if not the most fun draft we've had. Zed jungle is already really fun in and of itself, and then, you know, Akali's really been popping off as of late. That champion's been doing really well. Shen, I think, is something that people are really excited about after the buffs on the recent patch, and so bringing it all together and having this super aggressive, like, assassin-oriented comp where you can just use Shen ult to have Lucian, Akali, or Zed try to blow somebody up on the backline whenever they want. It's really, really fun. It's a really cool idea, and it did end up working out because their aggressiveness really paid off. Player of the series is pretty obvious to me. It's going to go to Monkey in the jungle. He is the player for WE. I'm tired of, like, trying to beat around the bush and say, oh, he's the heartbeat. He's the core of the team. This guy is WE. When he is succeeding, this team wins. When he's losing, this team loses. It really is as simple as that. I love Tyun in the bot lane. I think his, you know, progression throughout this split has been admirable. I think Vampire has definitely gotten better, and Cube and Karis have really not been the worst players in the entire universe, but Monkey is really the one where it's like, okay, you're the player that's Group Ascend worthy here. How much can you create for the rest of this team, which is like top end of Group Nirvana worthy? And I think Monkey has shown that he's able to do a ton in that regard, and I think he completely outclassed Tion in this exchange, which is really not, like, possible for Weibo Gaming. Like, they cannot get away with that. This is an embarrassing performance from Tien on the other side. Absolutely embarrassing, but Monkey has continued to be awesome for this team. Trundle is not a pick I'm a fan of. Zed is very greedy, and yet somehow, some way it continues to work out. So credit to him, and, you know, credit to the development he's continued to make. He has been the big difference maker ever since coming in, I believe, at the start of spring. It's been so long now, I can't remember if he played in winter as well, but, you know, obviously replacing Tianjin after, you know, this offseason looked very funny for WE. He has been a straight upgrade. And then obviously you can point out a couple of other members as well. Tyun continues to, further his development. He's just been super consistent as a secondary option for this team, and I think that's a perfect role for him. He is really developing into that scrim demon that we always heard about in the LCK, but it's nice to see it actually on stage now. I think Cube had a really good series throughout basically all of this. Breathe was actually doing a pretty decent job on the other side, establishing tempo on the top side of the map, and Cube shut that down real quick in terms of a lot of what he was doing on the Shen in particular in game number 2. Karis did not fold at all to Xiaohu, and I get, we talked about this earlier. Xiaohu's not a good laner, and so you can kind of sit there and be like, well, Xiaohu losing in lane, who's surprised? But Karis winning in lane is definitely much more of a surprise, so that's good to see. Vampire was, totally fine on the Renata and the Braum. Certainly not a Vampire series, but overall, it's just a nice win for WE, and this could actually matter a lot for their seeding. It doesn't really determine whether or not they're going to have to win a play-in series, but having to beat Edward Gaming versus having to beat Ninjas in Pyjamas could actually matter a lot in terms of how things end up going. And for Weibo on the other side, this is a pretty bad loss. Tien was really bad in this series. He's going to get dead of the series for me, but I think you could go in a couple of different directions here. I think basically everybody played bad for Weibo. Xiaohu played quite poor in the mid lane. This is where his lack of, laning ability really comes into fruition, where when Weibo is struggling elsewhere, when Tien is losing on his own in the jungle, where Light and Hong aren't able to generate pressure 2v2 on the bottom side of the map, you kind of need your mid laner to be able to step up if he's going to be as good as Xiaohu is, and he's just not that kind of player. You kind of need him to be able to win lane on his own, and he's always going to look bad when the rest of the team is crumbling because he can't scale into the late game where he is better, but that's part of the flaw of him as a player. Like, I'm certainly not trying to excuse him from all criticism. I just think it's, a little bit more circumstantial than maybe just, oh, Xiaohu's bad and, he's bad at laning. I think it's definitely much more, he just relies on his team more than a lot of other mid laners do. I think Hong definitely did not have a great bounce back series here. We've seen it take some time for supports in particular to come in and really affect their team in a positive way. Hopefully that's going to be the case with Hong. Again, I still feel like this on paper should be an upgrade, at least from a high-end perspective. I think your ceiling is higher with Hong in. Light has, very quietly been bad for this team across this split. I'm not going to say he's been awful, but he's certainly not been good for this team. He's a player that I've very much defended on this channel for a long time. 2023 was a real big breakout year for him, in my opinion, in terms of what he was for that Weibo gaming team. And even 2022 on LNG, I thought he was way better than he got credit for. And it finally felt like people were coming around to calling him the most consistent AD carry in the world just for him to have one of his weaker splits ever. It's really disappointing. Breathe was really the only bright spot on this team, and even then, he was doing it on Sion, and he was left out to dry by the rest of Weibo Gaming, so how much was there really to do? This is a bad loss for Weibo, not just in terms of where they are in the seeding, but in terms of the mental aspect of losing to WE so late into the split. It's really just not a good look, and WE, they continue to overperform. I had them number 16 in my power rankings, not only heading into winter, but heading into spring as well. We all collectively thought this was the worst team in the LPL, and here they are, potentially getting a top 6 spot coming out of the regular season. But that's going to bring us to our final series, not only of the week here in week number 8, but in the regular season in the LPL. And we close out with certainly one of the series of all time between Ninjas in Pyjamas and Thunder Talk Gaming. And Thunder Talk, of course they're picking up a win in the final series of the year. Of course this is how this is going to go down. The team that we have counted out for basically the entirety of the Group Ascend stage, because not only did they lose what I consider to be their most productive player in Bei Xuan, they replaced him with a player that I think is super overhyped in Xiao Huanggren, and everything has kind of fallen apart for this team. They've got the worst solo laners in Group Ascend by a large margin. Their bot lane has regressed because they don't get to play strong side, because everybody's losing all the time and their jungle never has pressure. All of it's going wrong for them. Of course they're the team to end the regular season with the victory, because that's just how things go here in the LPL. And of course, Ninjas in Pyjamas are the team that end up losing to them. This was a bad series all around for quite a few players in it for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Obviously, there's one that you have to point at and just be like, okay, I've been trying to defend you. This was not a defendable series from Aki, and we'll get into it because this was really bad. But for Thunder Talk, let's go ahead and get into it for them. Player of the series for me is going to go to Hoya on the top side. How are we here? How is Hoya going to be the final player to get player of the series in the regular season? That just feels a bit disrespectful, but obviously, jokes aside, Hoya played awesome in this series. He was super consistent across both of these games, but specifically on the Sion in game number 2. This is a champion they have been early picking for him quite a lot over the course of this split. It's clear that they just want to try and stay as consistent as possible on the top side of the map, and you know what? Congratulations to Hoya. He finally was able to unlock that ability to take over the game on the Sion. Just happy for this guy because he's kind of been treated very similarly to how Bertle was treated. Again, I consider them very similar players in terms of their reputations. I will continue to say Bertle is too 3-4 times the player that Hoya is individually as a player, so I think that that's fair to say. Bertel is way better than Hoya ever was, but, you know, Hoya has kind of been talked about as this player who's been given a lot of opportunities, who really only has a job because, you know, of his stature and the teams he's played for in the past, and he doesn't necessarily deserve it, and to some extent, I do believe that could be true, but at least he's showing up in a game that maybe doesn't matter all that much. ThunderTalk was already secure in their number 10 spot, but they went out, you know, and kind of very much punched their ticket to say, hey, you know, we still have some momentum and we still get to play a best of 5 because we're in Group Ascend. It doesn't really matter that we're in last place. So credit to Hoya. Satab was also really good in this series. He looked awesome on the Akali. I think at this point we just need to figure out who Satab is, and it's become incredibly clear to me. You get this guy on an assassin, something that he doesn't have to think about, where he can just be the damage dealer and just use his hands. He's going to be pretty good in that role. He's got pretty decent mechanics. He's not a bad player from that perspective. What he is bad at is making any sort of decision whatsoever on the map. If you force him to try and make any sort of macro play, oftentimes that's just going to go awry incredibly quickly when it comes to him as a player. So keep him on things like Akali. You know, the Talia worked in game number 2 because they won the game, but I don't want to see Talia. I don't want to see Ryze. I don't want to see Galio. I don't want to see any of these picks. I want to see Akali. I want to see Silas. I want to see LeBlanc, like we've seen him pop off on a couple of times. Like, I want to see those types of picks. Those are the things that I think Satab can really succeed on, and I think we kind of saw that once again here. Credit to 1xN and Feather. They finally had the opportunity to play the game as a 2v2, and I think that they kind of showed that they're pretty good at it. Leave and PP God did not have a very good week. All things considered, they are getting worse and worse every single game, and 1xN and Feather definitely took advantage of that, which is a very good sign. And even Xiao Huangren got in on the action here. I don't think he had the best series of all time. I think generally it was more so his opposing jungler just feeding resources to the enemy team, but Xiao Huangren was there and along for the ride and was decent setup, specifically in game number 1 on the Wukong. So credit to ThunderTalk. The win doesn't matter, but picking up a win is still really cool for them. And for Ninjas in Pyjamas, this is such a demoralizing loss. Obviously, every team at this point in Group Ascend goes into the play-in stage. They all have a shot. They have one best of 5 that they have to win in order to get themselves into playoffs, but this has looked so bad for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Like, it's just such a horrible week, and it's a horrible outcome, and all of these players seem to be regressing, and their synergy seems to be getting worse. Whatever boon or boost they got from Solo Kill coming into the lineup has definitely worn off at this point in terms of how things are going, and unfortunately for them, Aki just is not playing well. He's definitely dud of the series here. This is probably his worst individual series in terms of gameplay. I've been willing to defend Aki a lot of times because I really do think that if he were on Edward Gaming or, you know, Ultra Prime or LNG or one of these other teams, we would be praising him in Group Nirvana for being able to run the bottom tier of the LPL, and I still believe that to be true, but this is just one of those, like, at some point you got to figure out how to survive at this level, and he just, if you're getting gapped by Xiao Huangren, like, that's bottom of the barrel. Xiao Huangren is a player that I do not think would go down into Group Nirvana and be phenomenal at that level. I think he would struggle in Group Nirvana because I don't think he's a very good jungler, and Aki just got completely blasted by him. I say that, but it's not like Xiao Huangren was the one to do it. Aki ran this game down himself, and it's really frustrating. I think he's just completely out of mental at this point, and that looks like a lot of this team. Doinby looks tilted beyond belief, and if that's going to be the case, this team is entirely doomed. If he's not fully mentally locked in, there's no way this team is going to be able to succeed because he is the one hope they have of being able to win games. Solo Kill has been very good for this team on the top side, but he's not going to be enough to be able to pick up a series win against a team that we'll talk about in a moment in FPX that I think is more than good enough to take them down, especially because Leave and PP God have also just gotten worse and worse and worse every single week that they've played together. PP God has had a really bad year, all things considered. He's not being talked about enough as an actual issue, a real problem for this team, but Leave had a horrible week. He makes, you know, these gigantic mistakes that we always talk about on this channel. It's just not good. Ninjas in Pyjamas are not very good, and I think that was showcased here, but if ThunderTalk's taking you down, that's a problem, and, you know, good on ThunderTalk for being able to pick up a win. Again, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day because they were locked in number 10 no matter what, and they're going to have to play a genuinely good team, and whoever gets number 7, which we know because this was the final series. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but at least they have some momentum going into a potential best of 5, and remember, in the play-ins, all you got to do is win one best of 5. You just have to show up on the day and be able to win. Everything else that's happened across the entire split is moot if you can win that series, and ThunderTalk gave themselves the most amount of momentum possible in order to make that. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL week number 8 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. It's the final week of the regular season done and dusted, and we are ready to get into the play-in stage. That kicks off, I believe, tonight as this video is going live, so I hope you guys are excited for that. But let's go ahead and wrap up the regular season with everything that we want to wrap it up with. That includes the week 8 player of the week and dud of the week. Again, typically we would go into power rankings and standings and all that stuff, but we're going to talk about more, I guess, a holistic stuff at the end of this video rather than just power rankings. But kicking off our player of the week conversation, it's the easy decision for me. It's going to be Pyjamas as the player of the week, the 80 carry for JD Gaming in week number 8, like I said. Just really dominant stuff from him across all 4 games he ended up playing. They dominated both series, Ninjas in Pyjamas, Anyone's Legend, and neither of them put up a huge fight against JD Gaming, and I think that's exactly what we were looking for. Pyjamas looks like an absolute animal right now. He has been a monster so far, the best 80 carry in the LPL, which we will reiterate as we continue to go on throughout the rest of this outro, throughout the rest of this video, so get excited for that. But of course, the Misfortune game and the Kaisa game in particular against Ninjas in Pyjamas to really blow up in that series, and then he was unreal on the Ezreal in Game 1 against Anyone's Legend, took down one of the best teams in the LPL. To me, very easy choice for player of the week. Honorable mentions, Knight, the mid laner for Bilibili Gaming. He was the only player that I think put up a good fight for player of the week. He was tremendous in both of BLG series. I just don't know if he was quite the main character that Pyjamas was for JD Gaming. Still very good, but maybe not quite as much as he has been in previous weeks. Maybe Knight's great track record is honestly being held against him here because he's had better weeks than this one. And then Monkey, the jungler for WE, is going to be an honorable mention as well. He was incredible in that series, and I had to give a shout out to the guy who pulled out the triple assassin, like triple ninja comp and ended up winning on it in his final series of the regular season. So Monkey and Knight are my honorable mentions, and then my dud of the week is going to go to Care, the mid laner for FunPlus Phoenix. He had a really bad week, all things considered. Shout out Aki, who is yet again an honorable mention, as he is for most weeks for dud of the week, but Care kind of ran away with the award in terms of how he played across their 2 series, got completely outplayed in both of them and never really had any sort of pressure. And so to close out week 8, Care is going to get my dud of the week, and Pyjamas is going to get my player of the week. But that transitions us nicely into talking about my award picks here for the end of the regular season. Of course, this is like the final wrap-up. Typically, I would do this in its own separate video at the end of the split, like an LPL playoff primer video or something of that sort, where I would kind of go deep into my, award picks, all the runners up, that kind of stuff, my MVP, all pro, etc. I'm gonna throw it on the end of this video because we just don't have time for a separate, like, all-encompassing playoff primer video. I hope you guys can understand with just how busy the schedule is this year, how many more games everybody's playing, the play-in stage happening basically tonight as this is coming out. I just couldn't quite find the time in order to do that, but I did want to throw in all of my award picks, so they are going to be going through up on the screen now. I'm going to go into them, but if I go over something a little lightly and you want to elaborate on it, you don't think I gave my full opinion, let me know in the comment section. I'm going to be pretty active and kind of looking at where you guys' opinions are and kind of helping to smooth out some why I put certain players in certain positions, because I certainly don't think that I am going to have the most consensus all-pro team of all time. But let's go ahead and get into it. No more posturing. Starting with MVP, and MVP to me was a pretty obvious decision whether or not a lot of people want it to be. Kanavi is going to get my Spring Split 2025 MVP. I didn't have to think about this too much. He got by far the most player of the series of anybody in the league for me. I think 3 more than anybody else. And by the way, these are including the placement stage games. I think that's only fair. I don't think that necessarily is going to be the case for the actual broadcast. I believe the broadcast is just going to take the Group Ascend and Group Nirvana player of the games and, all of those games into account, but I just didn't think that that was fair. The placement stage is a part of the Spring Split, so I took them into account when calculating my player of the series at the very least, and that's why Kanavi is, really pushed over the top in comparison to everybody else, but Knight and Pyjamas are going to be my honorable mentions. Kanavi just was the most dominant player across the regular season. I get that recency bias might lead some people to believe that Knight is in better form right now, and he is in better form right now, but Kanavi was better across the entirety of the regular season. To me, it was not even close. Knight really didn't have that strong of a start to Group Ascend, and people forget that. If he did, he probably would have won MVP, but this is not an award to talk about the best player by the end of the regular season. This is the best player during the regular season, and that is Kanavi, in my opinion. Knight is obviously my number 1 honorable mention. He is definitely the runner-up here. Third place could go to quite a few people. I put Pyjamas on here because I do think he was easily the best AD carry and deserved it. We'll get to a couple couple of the other members, players like Jeje were in consideration for me. I think even a player like 369 could feasibly be in consideration for me. There are a couple of different options, but I landed on these three as my front runners for MVP. I'm not doing any sort of rookie of the split graphic here because there's no rookie that actually had substantial playing time in the spring split, at least in Group Ascend. It's just Erha. Like, if you wanted to just give it to a Group Ascend player, Erha would be the option, but as you guys know, I was not a big fan of how Erha ended up playing for Weibo Gaming, and, you know, Xiaoshe is like the other main option for Ultra Prime. There just aren't great options, I would say, down in Group Nirvana either, so I abstained from making a rookie of the split graphic. Whoever you want to give it to, I think, is kind of up to you, but let's go ahead and go over my All-Pro teams, shall we? Starting with my first team, All-Pro, and the players that I consider the best in their role in the regular season. They're going to be up on the screen now. I don't know how controversial these picks are going to be. I think these are the most standard picks in each role. I think these should be the standard picks in each role, and honestly, I would kind of be shocked if anybody went a different direction in every position here, maybe with the exception of support, where I think it's a little bit more open-ended, but we'll talk about that. My first team All-Pro is 369 from Top Esports in the top lane, Kanavi from Top Esports in the jungle, Knight from Bilibili Gaming in the mid lane, Pays from JD Gaming in the bot lane, and Kale from Anyone's Legend in the support position. I think all 5 of these guys were clearly the best in their role. 369 was clearly the best top laner and the most consistent. In my opinion, he had the high-end games of a lot of the other top laners without having kind of the blow-up performances that a lot of the other ones had. I think Kanavi was my MVP. It should be obvious why he's my first team All-Pro. Although I know some people are not always in favor of doing that. I know some people who are going to put their MVP as their second team All-Pro player. I think that's an absurd concept. How can you be the most valuable player and not first team All-Pro? I just don't think that makes any sense in my brain, but Kanavi is definitely getting it here. We already talked about Knight and Pays as well. Knight really came on at the end of the split as the best player in the entire league. If he had done that for more than just the final 4 weeks, he probably would have won MVP, and Pays has been spectacular, has really stepped up for a JDG team that really needs it. Support is the only position that's kind of up for debate, in my opinion. I went with Kale. I think that there are 2 really good other options, and they're going to be in my other All-Pro spots, so we'll get to them, but in terms of consistency, I really do think he is head and shoulders above everybody else. As anybody who watches the channel knows, consistency plays a big part in how I select my All-Pro teams. I should probably go over my criteria at least a little bit here. One of my main concerning things, the thing that I really put the most amount of weight into in terms of selecting All-Pros, is how many wins do I think you as a player added to your individual team this split? How many wins would they have won without you, and how many wins were because of you? And obviously, it's not like a perfect science. I have my own internal grading metrics that I use. I've talked about that previously. I'm not going to reveal all of those because it would just take too much time, but I have my own internal grading metrics that I like to use to try to grade out these players, but generally it's just who added the most amount of value to their team across this split. That applies to MVP, that applies to the All-Pro rankings. It's all going to be kind of calculated under the same banner. That's not a power rankings. I don't think these are the best players in their role in terms of talent, although right now they might be in terms of the first team All-Pro, but that's not what All-Pro is for. All-Pro is not for me to tell you who the 3 best players in their role are. It's for me to tell you who I think the 3 most productive players in their role were during the spring split. So I hope that makes sense. Kale gets a lot of nods in that area because he was so consistent and he was such a big piece for a team that won a lot of games, and he won a lot of games for that team being the primary option. So, you know, that's my first team. Moving on to second team now, it's going to be consisting of Flandra from Anyone's Legend in the top lane, Jeje from Invictus Gaming in the jungle, Xiaohu from Weibo Gaming in the mid lane, Jackie Love from Top Esports in the bot lane, and On from Bilibili Gaming in the support position. Some controversial picks are going to start coming in here. This is where the less popular picks are definitely going to start living. I'm going to start with the ones that I know are going to be less popular, and that really is kind of highlighted by Xiaohu in the mid lane, who is definitely not going to be a popular pick for All-Pro. But again, what I want to reiterate, this is not a ranking of who is in the best form at the end of the regular season. This is a ranking of who did the most in the regular season. We can't ignore the fact that almost every single one of Weibo Gaming's victories across this split has been Xiaohu. In fact, I think he's gotten 5 of the player of the series for their 6 series wins or 7 series wins that they ended up getting throughout the regular season. You can maybe point to every single series that they won across Group Ascend and point to Xiaohu and say, yeah, you're the one who ended up winning that series for them. Like, that's how relevant he's been in their wins. And I get that he looks real bad in their losses, but he's been very valuable to Weibo Gaming. I'm not sure they're even a top 7 team without Xiaohu in the mid lane. And again, because his style is much more late game focused rather than lane focused, I think he sometimes goes under the radar, but I will stick up for him. I think he's been better this split than than almost any other analyst will give him credit for. Jeje is the other player that I don't really see on a lot of other people's lists, and we'll get to who, because there's like 4 junglers right now that deserve to be in the All-Pro. One of them's going to get snubbed from everybody's, list. Jeje has kind of been the clear example that everybody else has snubbed. I'm not willing to snub him. He's maybe 4th in my MVP conversation right now. He really has been that valuable to an Invictus team that has been super inconsistent everywhere else. I can't justify thinking about players like the Shy or Rookie making an All-Pro team when Jeje has done so much more for that roster. So he ends up landing here on second team. Flandre should not really be a huge explanation. His great games look incredible. He's not the most consistent player in the world, but top lane's not the strongest role right now in the LPL. JackeyLove is another one that's pretty simple. I think Paze and JackeyLove were kind of fighting it out for first and second team for a lot of this split. Paze just ended up winning out by having a better final week. JackeyLove is still really good, and he's been very good. He especially stepped up in the middle of the split, kind of that, week 3 to week 6 era where he was awesome, probably the best AD carry in the league during that stretch. And On made a late push to be a first-team All-Pro guy, and he actually got more player of the series for me than KL did, but I think KL had a bigger impact on his team for AL than On did for BLG, and I think especially with BLG just getting back into form, On scrapes in as the second team All-Pro, but has a conversation to be in the first team. And then finally, closing it out with my third team All-Pro, it's going to be Breathe from Weibo Gaming in the top lane, Shun from JD Gaming in the jungle, Shanks from Anyone's Legend in the mid lane, Gala from Invictus Gaming in the bot lane, and Jue from FunPlus Phoenix in the support position. These were all pretty easy to do once I had established second team. A lot of the conversation is, okay, who's second team and who's third team? I think the top 3 in each role were pretty easy. I will talk about some snubs that I potentially gave that other people have been putting on their lists, and I'll kind of talk about why I wasn't considering them, but we're just going to go top to support in this regard. Starting with Breathe, this to me is a no-brainer. I've been seeing a lot of people exclude Breathe because he hasn't been quite as good down the stretch, and I agree. The beginning of a split was better than the end of a split, very similar to conversation to what we had with his teammate Xiaohu in second team, where he was better at the beginning of the split than he was at the end of it. But top lane's not a particularly deep role, and a lot of the players that I see taking Breed's spot on some of these All-Pro lists are questionable. I'll just say that. Like, Allah was not in conversation for me. That was never going to happen. The Shy was never in conversation for me. That was never going to happen. And so, with how a lot of the other top laner splits ended up playing out, Sheer kind of falling off down the stretch, Solo Kill not having a full split, like anybody else you kind of want to throw into that conversation just doesn't really have the resume. So Breathe ends up naturally getting third team, and I do think he was a bit underrated this split. A lot of really nice plays coming in from him. I think you could justify him on second team over Flandre if you really wanted to. I just don't really see it that way. Shun coming in third team feels like, almost an under-ranking of him. I think a lot of people are going to put him in their second team behind Kanavi, and that's generally entirely fair. I have basically no qualm with that. Again, top 4 junglers were all incredible, but what this means is that Tarzan is actually snubbed off of my All-Pro list, and for, me, that's definitely a weird thing, because people look at me as the Tarzan Glazer. That's kind of the reputation I've gained in the LPL community. To leave him off my All-Pro list when he's kind of topping a lot of the player of the game charts for a lot of people, I think is definitely going to be a surprise to my viewership. But I'm going to be honest, there was that small stretch of like a week and a half, 2 weeks where AL was just kind of losing a lot of games. Tarzan was like single-handedly losing them a lot of those games, and I know that that's not a big deal. There are players on these lists that have done more, but in the jungle position, which is the most stacked in the LPL, you can't really get away with that. Shun, Jeje, and Kanavi didn't have those same problems. Kanavi did at some points, but Kanavi had way more good games than Tarzan did, in my opinion. So Tarzan ends up being the one to get snubbed off the All-Pro list. I hope he proves me wrong in playoffs and ends up winning it all. But his teammate Shanks is going to get it here in the mid lane. He was good this split. I don't think mid lane was very good in the LPL this split. It's the reason Xiaohu lands on second team, because he actively was winning games for his team. Shanks comes in as a third team mid laner because he was pretty consistent, and he wasn't a focal piece. In fact, he was often the player playing in the background for Anyone's Legend, and yet somehow that's an All-Pro worthy selection. Typically for me, that's not how that's going to work. But again, mid lane was just not particularly good, in my opinion, from a depth perspective in the LPL in the regular season. Cream was not really someone I ever considered here. Rookie, I definitely didn't consider. I'm very shocked to see a lot of people putting him on some of their lists with the way he played a lot of this split. But Shanks ended up being the pretty easy selection for me once I had already put Xiaohu on the second team. Gala ends up taking the third team spot. This is where I think there is some discussion between Gala and Hope. I think it should be one of those two. It feels so bad to keep Hope off the All-Pro teams because he really did have a phenomenally consistent split. But that's it. right? When you look at AL's wins, how many of them can you look at and be like, Hope was the #1 guy on the team in this game? Not really that many. He was a very good piece on a team that was very good. Gala, on the other hand, when he won, Invictus won, and he's a big reason why that team turned their form around. Him and Jeja are 2v8ing a lot of the games that they end up playing, and Mako obviously getting back into form is a good thing for them, but I don't think Gala got enough credit for how good he was, and so maybe even just to buck the trend, I'm putting Gala here. I've also seen Elk on some of these lists. Sorry. Yeah, no thanks, man. Not after the first half of the split he had. Elk was not in consideration for me. Again, I think that that's more recency bias than anything else, and then finally, I've got Jue here. Honestly, is Jue like the first team All-Pro support in the LPL? I think there actually is a conversation to be made for that. Can you say that there was any player on a team outside of the top 6 that was more valuable than Jue was to FunPlus Phoenix? No, I don't even think that there's an argument. That's how good he was for that team. The problem is that team just didn't find a ton of wins, and so it's hard for me to sit here and be like, he added a ton of wins to FPX. Basically, every win they got, he added to them, but that's just slightly below where KL and On were at in terms of where I am. But I definitely wanted to get him on an all-pro list, and so he lands here on 3rd team. But, you know, that means Crisp is also like the main support, I would say, who's snubbed. There are a couple of other players that I think you could consider, but Crisp is definitely the main one that I think some people are going to see and be like, no, Crisp, all-pro? Sorry, man, he just wasn't the guy for top esports, and all-pro to me should symbolize who the guy was for their individual teams. So that's my all-pro list. I know it's a lot. I know that there is a lot of discussion to be had around a lot of these players. Leave what your thoughts are down in the comment section below. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are, but that's going to finally transition us into the final part of this video, which is the play-in matches. What's coming up basically tonight through Tuesday, I believe. We're going to have one best of 5 every single night to determine the final 4 teams to make the playoffs. As we know, Top Esports, Anyone's Legend, JD Gaming, and Bilibili Gaming have already qualified for the playoffs by being a top 4 team in Group Ascend. Every other team needs to win one best of 5 in order to qualify. It's a do or die series to get themselves in. It is the final teams remaining, so the final 6 teams remaining in Group Ascend, and then obviously, as we know, it's the top 2 teams from Group Nirvana, who we're excited to finally see play some games again. We can see it Invictus versus Edward Gaming, WE versus LGD Gaming, Weibo Gaming versus Thunder Talk Gaming, and FunPlus Phoenix versus Ninjas in Pyjamas are the 4 matchups. I will quickly talk about what I expect to happen in these series because I am not casting any of them. Invictus versus Edward Gaming, IG should be the best team in the play-in stage by far, but this team can be rather flippy. I don't think this will be a 3-0, if only because IG is going to troll one of the games in the series. The Shy is going to run it down for no reason, and that's just how it's going to go. So 3-1 IG would be my prediction. WE versus LGD, ironically enough, I think is probably going to be the closest series here in the play-in stage. I think LGD is incredibly scrappy, and I think they've got a lot of positive things going for them. That being said, WE is in good form right now, and they're better than they've been at any point. I have to trust that they're going to be able to get over the hump, even if I don't really believe in the talent on this team. So it's going to be a 3-2 for me for WE. Weibo Gaming versus Thunder Talk. As much as Weibo is completely out of form right now and Thunder Talk picked up a nice win at the end of the regular season, if Weibo lose this, that is a disaster for them. They should be able to take down Thunder Talk relatively easily. They usually step up when it matters the most. Xiaohu in particular typically rises to the stage of the game that he ends up playing. We'll see if that ends up happening. And then FunPlus Phoenix versus Ninjas in Pyjamas. Again, I'm going against recent form saying this, but I think NIP are going to be able to get the job done. They have more talent on this roster, and you really just need one of Aki or Leave to not be garbage, and you can trust Doingbi and Solo Kill to be in sort of a positive position for this team. So just to recap, I'm picking Invictus, I'm picking WE, I'm picking Weibo, and I'm picking Ninjas in Pyjamas. Let me know if you agree or disagree with those takes down in the comment section below, but finally, that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're gonna be talking about the LPL play-ins next week. We're gonna be covering all of the playoffs, but we also cover all 3 of the other major regions, so LTA North, LEC, and LCK every single week, and with their playoffs and all that stuff going on this channel. If you want to check all that out, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all